Over the past few years, I've read a lot of articles about the state of the economy. These articles will discuss the middle class and the state the middle class is in. Oftentimes, these articles will describe who's middle class and who's not, or they'll set the parameters or set the definition of who constitutes middle class and not. And almost always, I will fit this description. However, the way they further discuss the middle class, as in the middle class beyond just what the definition is, the other ways in which they discuss the middle class doesn't apply to me. I meet the definition of the middle class, but the information about the middle class just doesn't pertain to me. It's like their idea of a middle class person is completely alien to me. But why is that? I'm middle class. These articles that discuss the state of the middle class, they don't apply to me. Why is that? And I think I have the answer to that. I think it's because there are two different middle classes. Hi, I am the Knight of the Basilisk, and I just want to be clear about something. Normally, I will have, in my previous videos, I had a lot of links in the description, and I will be presenting a lot of information in this video. However, there won't be a lot of articles. That's because there's just too much information. There's just with the information in my previous videos, you saw how crowded the description was, and there's a limit to how much text I could put in the description. So I'm going to not cite some information I refer to. That is because some of the stuff is just it should be common knowledge. For instance, if I refer to the fact that housing's less affordable now than it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that is just common knowledge in my book. So I'm not going to cite anything that states that, whereas normally I would have in my past videos. So feel free to Google the information yourself if you don't see me citing a specific piece of information. But generally, I will have just a few citations for very specific things. Anyways, back to the topic. There are two middle classes. Now, just to be clear, before I explain why that is and what these two middle classes are, I just want to explain one thing. The middle class of the 1990s doesn't exist anymore. No, so the middle class of the 1990s, that's gone. Instead, today we have two middle classes. And the best way I can describe them are the patricians and the plebeians. Now, these were terms that were used in ancient Rome. The patricians were the old money, or people who already had wealth. The plebeians were the new money, people who just recently acquired their wealth or were trying to accumulate wealth. Now, both the plebeians and patricians of the old Roman days have a difference between the plebeians and patricians now. So, today, the patricians are, the old money, but they used to be the middle class of the 1990s. Basically, the patricians of today are the remnants of the middle class of the 1990s. They're old wealth, but they weren't always old wealth. They were previously trying to accumulate wealth. So in the 1990s, they were the new money, but they're just not anymore because that middle class doesn't exist anymore, so I can't put them in that middle class. As for the plebeians, basically, they're like the plebeians of the old Roman days. They're trying to get wealth or their new wealth. They just acquired wealth. But unlike ancient Rome, they have instead of acquiring wealth, they're acquiring money, but they're not actually getting a significant net amount of wealth. That is, they can't afford a middle-class lifestyle and middle-class salary. And whenever I hear news articles talk about the middle class in technocratic terms, they're talking about the patricians, usually. And when I hear articles lament the middle class, what it is today, they're usually talking about the plebeians. The whole reason I'm making this video is because recently I came across an article that is the perfect example of what I'm talking about here. And I don't have the link to the article. I could not find the article again. I tried looking the same place I found it, and for some reason I couldn't find it. So here's what happened in the article. There's this guy who's working a bunch of gig jobs. And he's struggling to make ends meet. And he compares his life to his father's life. His father makes a comparable amount of money as he does, but his father is more financially well off. Even though on paper they're making the same amount of money, they should be equally in the same socioeconomic status. But The son, or the guy who's working the gig jobs, he was struggling to make ends meet, and he was penny pinching and working gig jobs and was trying to get by. His father was splurging, spending money more freely without any money worries. And if you're thinking, well, wait a minute, the son should have been more responsible with his money, like following, Dave Ramsey advice. That's what the guy was doing. He was following the Dave Ramsey advice. He was penny pinching. He was spending with discretion. That's the thing. His father wasn't doing that. His father was well off, even though the two were making the same amount of money. It should have been comparable, but they weren't comparable. And mainly the reason why this is because the father already paid down his house. The father didn't have a whole bunch of student loans to pay off, and his father had a stable career that he's been a part of for 30 plus years, whereas the son was working side gigs and struggling to make ends meet. And this is the perfect reason why that article was a good demonstration of what the difference was between the middle classes. There are three main reasons why there are two different middle classes. The ones who already made it and the ones trying to make it. The three main factors being housing, career building, and education and payoff. And afterwards, I will also maybe get into what's different between the middle class of today versus the middle class of the 1990s. What the middle class of the 1990s had that the middle class of today didn't. Housing affordability is driving a wedge between the two different middle classes. If you already bought your home back when homes were affordable, congratulations. When your house appreciates in price, you gained wealth out of it. And you already paid off your house, or you're in the middle of paying off your house at an affordable rate. Those trying to get a home are being basically price gouged. They're buying homes they can't afford, typically, or they're just not buying homes at all, because they don't even stand a chance of buying a house. And rising housing prices benefit already existing homeowners at the expense of people trying to buy homes. So if a house was $200,000, you buy it, your mortgage is $200,000. I mean, minus the amount that you put down on your down payment. If a house is $800,000, you're paying more for a house, which means more money per month of your paychecks being dedicated towards the house, which leaves less surplus wealth. If you can even afford the $800,000 house to begin with. Now, NIMBYism is a movement of homeowners to pressure governments to pass policies that favor homeowners. So, people who already have homes are typically the NIMBYs. People who restrict, basically NIMBYism does two things. It restricts the building of housing or just development in general, whether it's housing or non-residential construction. And they restrict the type of houses that can be built. So the NIMBYs might say only single-family homes can be built in my neighborhood. This restricts the housing availability, and if cities don't build enough houses for people, there's not enough room for the people already living there who grew up there to buy a house there, and they probably have to move out of the area. So for instance, I grew up in this area my whole life, the area that I'm living in right now. I can't afford a house here. So I am not living out on my own. And I've been waiting 5+ years for housing to crash, and I still can't believe it hasn't crashed. When I walk around town, I don't see people who I grew up with. I don't bump into those people just because they don't live here. Everyone who I grew up, well, not everyone, but a lot of people I grew up with just moved out. And people from out of the area moved in because people who already live here can't afford the home. So basically the only people who can afford homes are the tech people who come from wherever over here. So basically the NIMBY movement represents the patricians, the people who already have money. They pass policies that favor them rather than people trying to get a house. So people who are trying to get a house, they're in the YIMBY, yes in my backyard movement, whereas NIMBY is the not in my backyard movement. And so basically there's that divide there. People trying to gain wealth versus people who already have wealth. And people who already have wealth are gaining wealth at the expense of the people who don't already have wealth. And the sad thing is local governments are incentivized to have high housing costs. At least here in California. At least here in California, local governments don't get income tax revenue. They get revenue from high housing costs. Or when a house is sold, they get the tax revenue from it. And that's why it benefits them to have a high housing costs. Many local governments resist meeting California state mandates to implement Section 8 housing. And in addition to that, they're just reluctant to follow other regulations mandated by the state regarding housing affordability. Now, I do not think Section 8 housing is the solution to a housing crisis. It only caters to low-end people, people like me who live in an area their whole life and can't afford a house here, or can't afford a house really anywhere unless I want to move like 2 hours away. That doesn't solve that issue. And the Section 8 people, they're not supposed to be middle class, and I'm describing a video on why there are two middle classes, but still, the fact that our local governments are resisting to provide Section 8 housing is just an example of how they're resisting housing affordability. It goes into the bigger picture. So, like I said in my first video, cities like San Francisco and San Jose, and I live near both of these cities, I live an hour away from San Francisco. They attract high-income earners who price out the current local residents. And the thing is, these governments, they represent people who are not yet their constituents or their residents, but these people come in after the cities represent them. So San Francisco attracts tech jobs. It attracts tech people here. They displace the current constituents of the politicians who decided to attract tech people. So basically, the local governments are doing a disservice to people who are already their constituents. I am one of those such people who get screwed, even though I don't live in San Francisco. What San Francisco does reverberates and affects me because I live an hour away, as I have described in my first video that I posted on this channel. Basically, the people who already have houses are the older generations, and they benefit more from the NIMBY movement than the younger generation. This isn't completely the case. My parents know of a couple their age that were in a housing situation, and the housing situation ended, so they had to find a new house, and they just couldn't because it was just too expensive. They had to move, find some other housing arrangement with a family member. So not all older generations are benefiting from, NIMBYism, but by and large, the older generation is the patrician middle class because they already have the houses that have already accumulated wealth, and the younger generations typically are the plebeians. But it's not just housing. There are two other factors for the schism in the middle class. The second thing separating the plebeians from the patricians is career building. So young people nowadays compete with people all over the world thanks to outsourcing, and it is hyper-competitive. One time when I was in high school, my mother tried to get me to do volunteer work that I did not want to do, just so I could put it on a college application. It's terrible. Now, there's this trend called just learn to code. If you're in a job that doesn't pay well because you're competing with people from all over the world or your job's being automated, there's a saying, just learn to code, meaning coding is still a good way to make a living. And so what you should do is learn to code. And is this the answer? And I'll say no. And the reason is, well, not only because of something currently happening, but because of a trend that has occurred. So basically, if you've seen the movie Grapes of Wrath, or I guess this is in the book too, I haven't read the book, I've only seen the movie. So in the movie, the family trying to escape the Dust Bowl and move to California meets someone who was just there. And he talks about all the other refugees from the Dust Bowl moving to California and how California is flooded with people seeking opportunities there, and how the influx of so many people prevents any single one from gaining opportunity. Basically, that same thing happens already. So in the 1990s, we had a lot of outsourcing, and there's a lot of blue-collar workers who lost their job. So my parents' generation hounded my generation, me being a millennial, get an education. And wow, the pressure was up. Get an education, go to college, get an education, go to college. So my generation is the most educated generation in American history, right? So we should be well off, right? No, we're worse off. So basically, if you go to college, get a degree, you're kind of still entry level when you go apply for a job. That's because the marketplace is flooded with people who have degrees, people who went to college. So the more college educated people chasing the same amount of white collar jobs, the less valuable any single one of them is. And so much so that there's a lot of people who get a degree who can't find a job worthy of that degree. This has already happened where blue-collar jobs were outsourced. That means that left only the white-collar jobs for people to get, and you got a lot of people chasing white-collar jobs, and the marketplace is flooded with people with degrees, but they were kind of shoehorned into that because there's no blue-collar jobs to go for. It's terrible. So if this is true, does that mean the just learn to code motto will get people, a whole bunch of people to flood into the coding industry? And will that mean that the coding industry is going to experience some mayhem? Well, let me propose this to you. It already has. So I know someone who is a tech person and they're having trouble finding a job. Like, they apply for a job, a half hour after the job's posted, like 30 other people apply for it. There's already a lot of people flooding the tech industry. I know that's more than just coding, but coding falls into the tech industry, in my opinion. And so, essentially, coding, there's a saying that just learn to code, but I haven't heard it for a few years, probably because people have figured out a few years ago it's no longer a helpful phrase. Basically, career development is more difficult when there's a lot of people, but not a lot of jobs. The jobs have gone elsewhere because we're competing with people from all over the world. And are politicians counterproductive to social mobility? I mean, the whole reason there's outsourcing is because politicians in our government make deals with foreign governments to allow for these outsourcing. Politicians allow for the outsourcing with the trade deals. Trade deals are sometimes outsourcing deals, let's face it. So, like when Richard Nixon opened up to China, I mean, that made us compete with workers from China, for instance, right? State and local politicians give tax breaks to companies to attract jobs for their constituents. This seems like it would offset the outsourcing of jobs and would help American workers' job prospects. But does this actually hurt the ability for the American to get a good job and build a career? Amazon is one such company that politicians want to attract with such incentives, but I linked 2 articles in the description of this video that discuss why this is a bad idea. First, Amazon warehouse workers bring down the average wage of warehouse workers in whatever locality they are introduced in. The politicians should be attracting well-paying jobs, not low-paying ones. The article I cited that mentioned this fact was from 2018, and Amazon has since raised the wage of its warehouse workers, but that's only because of pressure from individual politicians who are not necessarily the one that gave Amazon the tax breaks, as well as from unions. In fact, do you remember that segment that made the national news about how Amazon workers were getting government assistance because their wages were so low? Yeah, that probably contributed to the pressure to force Amazon to raise wages, but also it just shows that the jobs were so poor that the government assistance was subsidizing their low wages. This is not the type of jobs a politician should be attracting. But the other problem is that Amazon actually destroys jobs. It's a well-known fact that Amazon hurts traditional retail. And in case you didn't know the negative effects that Amazon had on jobs, it is discussed in the second article that I linked. So when politicians give a tax break to Amazon, they're helping a company become profitable. Tax breaks help Amazon, but they're helping a company that destroys jobs not only for their own constituents, but throughout the country. Thus, the whole idea that politicians give tax breaks for Amazon and it helps create jobs, no, either it creates terrible jobs that aren't really careers, instead of actually attracting real jobs, and it actually destroys jobs. American politicians really are counterproductive towards job growth and career development for the American worker. So when it comes to career building, the patricians are the people who basically came of age decades ago, and grew up in an era where you could get a good career and get a job, have it for 30 years, and it's worth it. It pays the bills. Plebeians are people who are getting a job nowadays only to find out it doesn't actually pay the bills. Now take what I say about flooding a marketplace with college graduates and people with degrees, and ask yourself, does this mean education has less payoff? Look at it this way. Education is just getting more expensive as time goes on. And the amount of student debt held by the American people is just growing. And also more people have to go get an education because there's less blue-collar jobs available because they're all being outsourced. So is there a statistic that can prove that education has less payoff? The answer is yes. I will link 2 articles in the description. One is Average Net Worth of Millennials by Age. And according to this graph, the net worth by age, people nowadays don't break even until the age 31. That is, nowadays, anybody below the age of 30 is expected to have a negative net wealth. So the amount they owe in liabilities is more than their assets. So also, there's another article. How do millennial finances compare to other generations? Now, look at the data point about the differences in wages between a college-educated millennial versus a non-college educated millennial. It's $1,000 per year difference. And when you look at the negative net wealth from the previous article I just talked about, it takes so long for millennials to build wealth. College is only paying off slightly, but the amount of student debt held by people is just so big. It's not worth it, really. In this case, the patricians are the people who already went to college and who graduated when college was affordable and didn't have so much student loans and got a better job for getting the degree. Plebeians are people who graduate college nowadays, end up with a lot of student debt, and the value of the degree isn't worth a whole lot. So why is this? Why is it that there's 2 middle classes? Why is there a patrician and a plebeian middle class? Well, like I said, the patrician middle class are typically people who are older because they're people who've already made it. And the plebeian class are the people who haven't made it because they're young or born too late to have made it, typically. But why is that? What is different about the middle class of today that differentiates it from the middle class of the 1990s? What is it about the middle class of the 1990s that just doesn't exist anymore? I have 4 basic pieces of information to point out. The first is the decline of budgeting power. In one of my previous videos, I think it was the second video, I talked about how a budget's a pie graph, and your essentials take up one part of the pie, and the discretionary budget is like this part of the pie. But as time goes on, that part of the pie gets smaller and smaller because the essentials eat up a larger and larger percentage of your budget. So the rising cost of necessities eats away at discretionary spending. The prices of non-essentials are down, but when the pie graph shows the discretionary budget as like this thin slice, then it doesn't matter. So we live in a world where like big screen TVs are getting bigger, fancier with HD. Basically, the amount you pay for a TV, you're getting more out of it. Basically, TVs are more affordable than they ever been. Yet healthcare, education, and housing are less affordable. The cost of retirement is also a tricky thing. It also the thing is, the decline in budgeting power is the decline in real wealth. So, are you paying $5,000 a year towards your IRA, or are you putting money in a 401k? That should be deducted from your budget. So, let's say you had a pension, you made $50,000 a year, and you had a pension when you retired. Well, let's say that pension was taken away, and instead you have to pay $5,000 for an IRA and maybe more towards a 401k. So that $5,000 is really a pay cut, disguised as contribution to an IRA. So basically, even though the cost of essentials is going up, we should not undercut the fact that your actual wage is going down when you factor in things you need to pay for or should be paying for. I mean, you should contribute to an IRA, right? It's essentially a pay cut. So it's that as well as actual rising cost of essentials. Now, the second point I have to make is the value of things that made middle class stable has declined, except for housing, and I think stocks. So the marketplace is flooded with college degrees. As I mentioned, a degree is worthless. Healthcare plans come with stipulations that might not cover your procedure. Or you might go to a hospital that's covered by your insurance, but they might have a doctor not covered by your insurance operating on you. I don't even know how that's even allowed. And so you might have to pay for the procedure anyway, even though you went to the right hospital. The hospital screwed up and you might have to pay for it. Although I think they recently passed a law to fix that. Still, it's just In general, private healthcare plans come with stipulations that might cover your procedure. So you might be paying arm and a leg for healthcare, and you still have to pay co-pays, deductibles, or the full cost of a procedure that's not covered. Social Security will pay about 70% of what it should by the time Gen X collects it. This is a crime. So, are you relying on Social Security when you get old? I hope. You probably are, because traditional pensions have gone away, and like I said, IRAs and 401ks are early pay cuts, and those 401ks, they could go down in value. So anything that makes you middle class and gives you financial stability is less stable now. Third is, housing is the only thing that consistently adds value to the middle class person's net worth, except maybe stocks. And so that makes the middle class more propertied than it used to be. So if you don't have property, then you're being price gouged for rents. You're paying rent, you're being price gouged because rents have also gone up. So that's more money out of your paycheck, which means less money available. So if this is the cost of living, the amount of money you need to make has to exceed it by a certain amount. And if your costs are going up, you're just barely getting past that point where you're making it. But if you don't have a house, your rents just keep going up and up. And the fourth thing is, we have a pro-debt economy. But debt needs to be paid off with interest. So having a debt-based economy prevents the middle class from generating wealth, because they are then setting aside money to pay off the debts. So it's hard for them to generate wealth because they're paying off the debt. Also, I consider debt negative net wealth. If you think of bookkeeping, you got liabilities on one side, assets on the other. Debt's a liability; you have to pay it off. It counts against your assets. So and low interest rates punishes saving. And I used to make money putting money in CDs. So if I take money I already have and put it in a certificate of deposit, I make money off it. Not anymore. And we live in a society that does not just value individual economic responsibility and budgeting. We want people to go into debt, it seems like. The average American cannot cover a $400 emergency cost, probably because of this. We have a society that encourages financial irresponsibility. So I mentioned housing costs are unaffordable. Well, part of what's driven the high housing costs is that interest rates have been low. But now that interest rates are rising, they're rising on houses that already have a skyrocketing price. Whereas if they've been rising steadily since 2008, that would have prevented housing from skyrocketing so much. Having an average housing cost of $500,000 and raising the interest rate wouldn't be so bad if the average housing cost was $300,000 and the interest rate was raised. And my conclusion is, basically there's two middle classes. The people who already made it and the people who haven't made it and are struggling. If you have not already bought your house, if you have not already built up your career or got a job and have advanced enough, or if you haven't already gone to school and paid off your student loan debts, you're probably struggling. The sad thing is, the people who have already made it, the people in the patrician class, don't seem to be doing a whole lot to help. They're, like I said, they're the NIMBYs, the people who have the saying, not in my backyard. They're the politicians who, I don't know if there's class warfare going on. I don't know. They're just not helping people. Particularly in San Francisco, I've never seen a city screw its already existing constituents to get different constituents migrating into the city. Just the amount of internal migration, I guess you would call it, is just staggering. Basically, I don't know of anyone who's really representing people in politics. Maybe you have a few voices, but they don't seem to be gaining a lot. It just bewilders me how few people in politics seem to be concerned about the middle class, and how middle class concerns don't seem to be gaining traction or gaining the attention of the government. I'm not advocating for government to implement socialist programs. Just allow for houses to be built, or at least don't actively screw over the middle class that is already your constituent sometimes. As like these politicians that screw their constituents over, it's just, I don't know how that even happens in a democratic society. And it's typically the people struggling are young, and this is scary because the young people are the future, right? And not only that, the fact that the young people are struggling to get by means they delay buying a house. The age of getting married and having children is pushed back. People are having fewer children. And then when we retire, we're going to have less money from Social Security. We're not going to have traditional pensions. We're going to have 401ks that fluctuate in value. So then who's going to take care of us? Are we then going to be a burden to the next generation, which is going to be smaller than us because we're not having a lot of kids? Or us being millennial, people like me, millennials. And what is so concerning to me is how quickly this shift occurred. This shift occurred very quickly. So in 2008, even when we had a financial crisis, between that and 2012, we sort of had the middle class of the 1990s. It was the bare remnants of it, but we barely had it. But by a few years later, it just completely went away. An example, I live in California. I live an hour away from San Francisco. When I first moved out of my house in 2012, rent was $1,050 a month. And that was at the cheapest place I could get it. And that was higher than was advertised. I think between the time they advertised the place and by the time I got the place, it had risen $100 a month. When I left in 2015, rent was $1,230 a month, and and if I had renewed my lease and stayed in one more month, it would have gone up to $1,330. But it could only go up $100 so much a month because of rent control. But it had gone up that much in just the 3 years. However, the people who were going to come in after me weren't affected by rent control and were going to be paying $1,600 a month, $1,600 a month. So basically, rent jumped roughly 50% in a 3-year period. And that was on like the lower end of rent. This is not on a fancy apartment. This was like the lower end apartment, like the cheaper apartments. So just how quickly this shift occurred is concerning to me. The fact that no one seems, like people are talking about the middle class like it's the same middle class of the 1990s, which it's not. That middle class is gone. We have two different middle classes. One is the remnants of the middle class of the 1990s, but they're now not really the middle class. They're I hate to say aristocracy because they're not. It's just I don't know if there's any equivalence of this in history. I call them the patricians because that's the best term I have. And then we have the plebeians who are struggling. Middle class people can't afford a middle class lifestyle. Therefore, are they middle class? And I call them middle class like what we would define as a middle class person. So if you're making $50,000 a year, are you a middle class person? According to these articles I read that talk about the economy, they describe a person making $50,000 a year as middle class. But you can't make a living off $50,000 a year. Maybe you can in some very cheap parts of the country, but it's just harder to afford a middle class lifestyle in more and more parts of the country. Anyways, I am the Knight of the Basilisk. I hope you enjoyed this video. Take care.